good afternoon. I am Randy Bromberg, Senior Vice President of Communications and Marketing for BioNJ. Thank you for joining us for this special program this afternoon. I see a number of familiar faces and names out there, so thank you for being here. As many of you know, BioNJ has been passionately working over the last 2 years to increase health equity in clinical trials, and many of our members have been helping us to do that. So we're thrilled to bring you today's webinar. Only by discovering new approaches, utilizing new technologies, and developing new business standards can we make trials more accessible and ensure that no patient is ever left behind. So once again, we're excited to bring you together this afternoon for our Health Equity in Clinical Trials Best Practices webinar. Today's program is meant to be interactive, so please don't be shy. Share your ideas, ask questions, and explore possible opportunities for collaboration. We are recording today's program, so we will have it on the BioNJ website tomorrow for the community to watch. We're going to hear from 3 industry experts today who will share case studies on methods and techniques that their organizations are using to broaden reach and expand diversity in clinical trials. And to ensure that we have plenty of time at the end for audience participation, we will have Q&A after our 3 presentations. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box so we can get to them at the end. So let's get started. To kick us off, it is my honor to welcome Senior Director and Head of Global Demographics and Diversity for GSK, Michelle Reed. Michelle, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Absolutely. Most people in the room understand what we're talking about when we get into clinical trials, but just to make sure we set a good foundation, we're specifically talking about putting investigational drugs or devices in with people and seeing how that reacts and what benefits we can perceive from that activity. We're basing this on the science of participation in a representative population. And the real goal, if we move to the next slide, is to make sure that we cover everybody involved. If a doctor is sitting in front of a patient, we want both that doctor and that patient to be able to build a medical recommendation and path forward that they have confidence in. And they have confidence in that decision when they have data that looks like that patient. So when we're talking about representation, we're typically thinking about things that you see on a medical label that is related to the person's metabolics and how that either disease or product is going to interact with them. And we also think about inclusion with respect to making sure everyone in our society is able to participate in this process and also benefit from the process. So that's oftentimes things that you don't see in a label, like how much somebody makes for earning. You don't see, hey, this drug or this device is indicated for people who earn a certain amount. That's typically not how approvals work. So I just wanted to set the stage for that and make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So what does that mean, and what kind of barriers on the next slide will we see when we try to get clinical trials in front of as many people as possible? There's 4 big areas that we have barriers that we try to work against here. And on the top left, in the location that we're conducting our clinical trials at the sites, sometimes there's just a lot of work. These are practices where people are actually trying to manage patients and the daily effort there. There's a lot of different people and different types of identities that people are working with and so on. And so there's some elements that are local to that site. At my level, in the sponsors, in the bottom left of this slide, a lot of times companies like to use where they know that they can operate a site, they know that they can operate a clinical trial that may not be the best location for that, but if they know they have good operations, sometimes it feels very comfortable, very familiar. And so that's something. Of course, there's financial constraints and time constraints. Sometimes there's scientific constraints and so on. On the right-hand side is the people, both the doctors and the patients, and that's where we will talk about some of our case studies. So when we get into the patients, and I'll talk about the bottom right on the next slide as well, specifically when we're talking about underrepresented populations. There's all sorts of intrinsic and extrinsic components that limit somebody's willingness and interest to interact with the healthcare system. And so on the next slide, when we think about underrepresented populations, the culture of a person really builds upon how they interact with the clinical work, as well as any sort of treatment options that they may have. Whoever you are, however you see yourself, if you're a man or a woman, if you are old, if you're young, if you are Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, it doesn't matter. You have a unique relationship with the healthcare system. And that's dependent on that entire configuration of who you are. And your priorities and the outcomes that come from that are all built upon that relationship. So coming from that, I'm going to walk us through 2 case studies that GSK had an opportunity to do. And the first one on the next slide here is with an organization called MIORA. MIORA is basically an undergraduate fellowship program. That's the best way to describe them, running in Los Angeles County in California in the United States. And this was started up by a doctor who saw that, hey, I have these students from all walks of life. We're doing more and more diversity within the student population. Why don't we use that and build a communication channel into the community? And so it's a multi-tier benefit that comes out of this. You have educational programs that enrich the student's education. So in our case, what we did is we brought ovarian cancer and clinical trial data to these student populations. And they learned about that and saw what benefits to diverse populations were important because of the prevalence and incidence of ovarian cancer, particularly in women of color. And then what you were able to do is have these students come back into their own communities and speak. So for example, somebody who looks like me going to talk to a Latina about her ovaries is probably a really challenging conversation to have. However, a young woman in her community who she's familiar with because she's a neighbor has a very different ability to have that conversation and a very different ability to relate and break down some of those barriers and allow that woman to then say, oh, maybe this is something I really want to get more information about from my physician. So this was the opportunity that we were able to interact with MIORA, and we've been working with them for the last couple of years to great success. And then we'll move on to the next slide as well. So somewhat in the same vein of getting to the community, this is an organization that we worked with. The name is Tiger Lily Foundation. And Tiger Lily was founded by a woman who survived breast cancer herself, African-American, actually Liberian woman. And she really needed to advocate for herself. And she saw through this, in fact, her mother was a nurse. And even with that exposure to the healthcare system, struggled to get support that she needed to get. And so within that, she saw that women of color, particularly in this case, we have one of the angels that you can see on the right as part of the organization, looking to establish educational content for both women who have received a diagnosis in breast cancer. We were focusing on triple negative breast cancer, which is particularly aggressive, especially negative outcomes for women of color. And so what we were able to do is interact with this patient advocacy group, provide educational content that was not attached to any clinical study. And just to say, hey, you may have been diagnosed with a very life-changing, life-altering diagnosis that you may feel has turned your world upside down. Here's some information to understand how to move forward and make the best of the situation. And we know that understanding and bringing that awareness to these women makes an enormous difference in the outcomes, because what we see is women of color tend to get diagnosed later, and that time lag creates a massive differential in outcome. And then most recently, the My Living Legacy effort was built around some programs that we did in locations to bring more information to the communities, not so that they would have to travel, but that they could see this locally. Those are the ones. I wanted to run through that relatively quickly. I know we'll have slides to provide, but I also want to open for any questions along the way. So back to you, Randy.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful, and I do look forward to diving in deeper detail with some questions. Next, we are going to hear about decentralized clinical trials. The FDA defines a clinical trial as a clinical investigation where some or all of the trial-related activities occur at a location separate from the investigator's location. So our next presenter is going to dive into how to use these types of trials to broaden reach and improve patient and site and sponsor experiences. Please welcome Vice President for Decentralized Clinical Trials and Patient Registries at Medidata, Kelly McKee. Welcome, Kelly.
Thanks so much, Randy. And it's really nice to be here with all of you today. You know, Michelle really set the stage super well about why it's really important to expand clinical trial opportunities to more diverse people and some ways that you can go about doing that. Today, I'd like to talk to you about how clinical trial design can really also impact the ability to enroll a more diverse patient population and why it's so important to introduce a choice into your clinical trials so that more people can participate. And we can go to the next slide. So Randy set it up for me. I can skip this slide. Actually, we all know what a decentralized clinical trial is, and I think it's just really important to level set that, right? So that we're all speaking the same language, if you will. So DCT is one where one or more components that traditionally would have occurred at a trial site are done outside of that trial site. So it can incorporate a lot of things. And why is that so important? Well, it's important that we make clinical trials easier to participate in so that we can enroll more diverse people into our trials. It's not just the right thing to do, but we now have expanded regulatory pressure to increase diversity in trials because historically we haven't done a good job of it. So now the regulators are saying, well, you haven't done it all well on your own. So now we're going to make you do it the right way. And we've had some good guidance come out recently, and you will all soon be required to create these diversity action plans for late stage clinical trials. We can go to the next slide. You know, I was speaking to a site the other day, and she told me that she has this notebook of over 80 logins, 80 logins and passwords for all of the disparate systems that she's required to log into for the clinical trials that they run. That's a huge burden on sites, and it's a huge burden on patients. So when we try to incorporate aspects of DCTs, we've got to do it the right way so that patients don't have to log into 10s, 20 different systems with all these different passwords and remember to do one thing and remember to do another. That's why we've created a single platform for all DCT needs, which incorporates fully decentralized trials and hybrid trials as well. So allowing patients to move seamlessly from e-consent to eCOA to live video visits, depending on the needs of the studies, makes it easier to participate, and that helps retain patients as well. We can go to the next slide. So don't have a lot of time with you today because, again, we want to open it up for questions and have a really robust discussion, but I did want to share with you a case study where we helped support a large cardiovascular study by setting up a patient database first to help educate, engage, and empower patients to prepare them for clinical trial participation, and then moving into decentralized aspects. So e-consent in multiple languages with interactive content for guidance and comprehension, reconsenting capabilities, multimedia support, because we all don't learn the same way, and then moving into patient-reported outcomes through ePro. So getting that information back from patients in a way that's really friendly towards them, moving on to live video visits or televisits, and then returning that data back at the end of the study as well. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Kelly. Our next speaker is going to share a case study of an actual trial done at Rutgers. So please help me welcome Dr. Sanada Gore. She's a director of the Clinical Research Center at Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, and she and two of her colleagues are going to dive into a clinical study that they're working on around long COVID, and in particularly recruiting children. So we look forward to hearing from Dr. Gore and her colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy, and thank you for this opportunity. I'm delighted to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. Let me just start with saying that I learned the importance of diversity and inclusion firsthand very early in my career, working on HIV/AIDS and clinical trials, particularly in children. And I have carried that lesson both at the clinical level forward and the research level forward into my career now through COVID. And now, of course, for the last several years, I have had the opportunity of working entirely in clinical trials as a director of the Clinical Research Center at Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. So next slide, please. So I'll begin with just a brief introduction of the research center, so just so you have an idea. So the clinical research, there are two at Robert Wood Johnson Medical School, one for the adults and one for pediatrics. And we are very fortunate to have state-of-the-art facilities dedicated to clinical research. And also we do all non-oncology clinical research at Rutgers. The oncology happens at Cancer Institute of New Jersey. So we have the facilities, it's all in one space, research dedicated, but most importantly, we have a team of staff, and you can see them in the bottom there, that are dedicated to research and highly trained personnel. So we run about, between the two centers, we run about 80, at any one point in time, we are working on 80 to 90 clinical research studies, not all interventional, but all different kind of clinical trials, interventional, observational, everything. Next slide, please. So I'm going to present to you some data. We looked at what is the participant diversity at our center among all the studies that we are doing. And actually, this was study is an ongoing study, and I'm just sharing some data preliminary. It was really spurred on by BioNJ coming to us and saying, hey, how are you doing with diverse enrollments? And, honestly, I had always been concerned about that. And so that got us thinking and taking a look at our data. And so we looked at, this is March 2018 to March 2020, so a small snapshot. We looked at a total of 40 studies, 22 adult, 18 pediatrics. And there were 1847 subjects in the adult studies and 574 subjects in the pediatric studies. And we compared the breakdown of race from, in our CRC compared to Central New Jersey. And as you can see in the left-hand side pies, we weren't too bad. I was a little surprised. We were a little bit higher in the white population and lower for the African-American population, but it was quite close. And when we look at the ethnicity, again, we were close to the Central Jersey makeup. We weren't very far. We were low, but not terribly low. Next slide, please. So when we drill down further by the study types, though, what we find is in the race left-hand side pies, in the race breakdown, it was the interventional studies were more often done among whites, whereas the non-white populations were more highly represented in the observational studies. So we do have a problem in really reaching out to non-white populations for interventional studies. In the ethnicity breakdown, we are not seeing as much of a difference, but this study is still going on with larger numbers, and we might start to see more differences. Next slide, please. And then we looked at pre and post-COVID. Of course, COVID changed a lot in how we were enrolling and who was being enrolled, particularly because there were so many, the Hispanic and the Latino and the Black populations were so highly affected by the pandemic. We did do quite well with enrolling the diverse participants in the post-COVID era versus pre-COVID. As you can see, this is on the left-hand side is the race breakdown in the pre-pandemic phase versus post-pandemic phase. And you can see that we are seeing a better non-white participation in the post-pandemic phase. And then we broke it down by during the post-pandemic phase, what was the breakdown of participation in COVID-19 versus non-COVID-19 studies. So as you can see, it was the COVID-19 studies that enrolled more non-whites, which drove these numbers. So this is just a snapshot. And I'm going to now share a study that we are doing currently. And I have two of my coordinators that hopefully will be able to share our experiences. So with this background, let's move to the case study. So we are doing a study called RECOVER, which is a study, very large NIH-funded cohort study. It's observational, looking at long COVID, its effect on both adults and children. We are participating in the pediatric study and following people for 4 years, doing lots of different testing, etc. So we are enrolling children and young adults up to age 25 and their families. The emphasis on this study from NIH has been on diversity, both racial, ethnic, rural, language, all of it. It is really, really focused in on that. And the study has utilized decentralized strategy, like some of the things that Kelly is talking about. And we are partnering with home-based clinical research organization that can go out to patients' home and do some of the study procedures. And we are using this TASO device, which is a home-based blood sample collection kit, which families are able to use at home. And we have in here, there's e-consenting, electronic surveys, and all of those things have been into this study. So next slide, please. So one of the things we did is to improve our diverse participation. We really honed down on bringing in bilingual clinical staff, research trained. And that has made a whole lot of difference. We've had a community engagement strategy through the Community Engagement Core, through statewide parent advocacy network, Robert Wood Johnson Hospital's Community Health Promotion Program, which has community health promoters. You see their pictures in the bottom there. It's a group of very enthusiastic community workers that have worked with us closely to spread the word and get the people in from our local New Brunswick community. We work with student groups at Rutgers, at Student Health, family success centers, and the federally qualified health centers, and we've held community events. And all of this, next slide, please. All of this concentrated efforts has really amazingly surprised us at how well we've been able to do. So these are the enrollment data as of November 30th, 2023. So we have a total enrollment of 555 children, and then their families also. But you can see by embedding ourselves into the Latino community, we have such a large 295 of these are Latino families. We actually haven't done as well among whites in this particular study so far. So this is a really good example, I felt, of showing how community-based strategy can improve it can improve community education about COVID and long COVID, as well as bring people into a study. So this is where I'll end, and I'm hoping that during a Q&A, you'll hear from Christian Suarez, who is our lead coordinator for this study, and Bibiana Vargas Ferrero, who is one of the other coordinators. These two folks, you saw their pictures earlier, and they are with us today. They have a lot to share on how they reached out to the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Gore. And we are going to open up the floor for some Q&A. I do have a colleague on the line who's going to help me navigate that. The first question that is actually for you, Dr. Gore, what challenges have there been to getting underserved communities to either live or telesites?
So I think, I presented the study that we've been very successful in. Let's keep in mind that it is an observational study. So it's really not an interventional study, and we still struggle in interventional study in getting diverse communities to come in. And I think from my perspective as a clinical researcher, and this Michelle had mentioned also, is that the study design is really comes in the way. It's not real world pragmatic design in general. And I think the inclusion, exclusion, the schedule of events, they are just so difficult for people to be able to follow. A lot of times it's the schedule of events. And now maybe with the decentralized studies, that will get better. But to the extent that those can be improved, I think it would really make a difference. The barrier of data entry systems, as Kelly mentioned, our coordinators complain of the same thing, is that each study has a different data system, different logons, different things trained. That could be centralized in some way, like what Kelly said. That would be godsend for a clinical trial site. Lack of translated materials. We still continue to see clinical trials being launched and not everything has been translated. And at this point in time, that should not happen, at least in one, at least Spanish. I mean, I understand you can't do every language, but we should try. I mean, I think, why do we still see that? That, of course, is a problem. The staff issue, I mean, I think I'm just so glad this is really, believe it or not, the first time we have hired bilingual coordinators. And there are just not many people trained in those communities who are bilingual and from that background. And the extent that needs to be beefed up so we can have more people who can be hired. Of course, there's mistrust. I think more education about clinical trials in the community. I can't say enough about that. I mean, that continues. I think COVID pandemic has been a double-edged sword. In one side, yes, it was people learned what a clinical trial is and what's phase 2, phase 3, phase, and a vaccine study. People learned a little bit, but then there's been so much distrust around the vaccine and it's just gone the other way. And people are very distrustful at this point in time, and we really need to do something to improve that, to get people to know what a clinical trial is, what is clinical research. So, I mean, all of those, I'm sure others have to, share things in here as well.
Thank you. And before we go to the next one, Kelly or Michelle, if you have anything to add on.
Yeah, absolutely.
Kelly.
I think that clinical trials are beautifully scientifically created, right? By really, really smart people. But humans are not perfect. And so if we design a scientifically perfect study, we can't enroll it because humans are not perfect. And so I think that it's really important to understand the patient population who will eventually benefit from the medicine that's being studied, and then design the clinical trial for those patients. That not only is going to make it easier to participate, you're going to be able to find more people, and you're going to be able to enroll a more diverse set of patients because you're really designing for that end population, if you will. I saw there was another question around, do DCTs improve diversity? And if it's okay, I'm just going to combine the questions. DCTs can help improve diversity by making clinical trials easier for more people to participate in, but it's not the only thing that's necessary. So first, you need to understand what that patient population looks like who will eventually benefit from the medicine. If the patient population, and I'm just making this up, right, who will eventually take the medicine is 80% African-American women, then you should not enroll 80% Caucasian men into your study. I know it sounds like, well, yeah, but that's what historically we've done. And we need to stop doing that. So first, understand what your patient population looks like, and then take a look at what clinical trials in that therapeutic area or indication have looked like in the past. So you know what your benchmark is, right? So then you know where you need to be, and you know where you are now, and you can understand that delta, because knowing's half the battle, right? I think that was a G.I. Joe reference back from the 80s, my childhood. And then you need to find sites that have historically enrolled more diverse patients, but then you need to look outside of those. So go into communities that historically haven't participated in clinical research and find new investigators who see those patients. There are, and I know that sounds scary because you're like, oh my gosh, well, they've never participated in research before. It's so hard, and it is hard, but there are organizations like integrated research organizations who go in and take the burden, that administrative burden off. So those are some of the things that we can do to help improve diversity, but it's not like a magic bullet, for lack of a better word. That's terrible phrase, but it's hard. It's hard to improve diversity, and so we really need to put the effort in.
Yeah, and I'll continue the thought there. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, right? That's what you were trying to get at, and that's the same thing for DCT. It's the same thing for how we approach a protocol design. The education and information that we need to provide to a population for who's going to participate in a vaccine study is very different, and the motivation for conducting yourself and including yourself in a vaccine study is very different than the motivation you might have if you have stage 4 cancer. On the vaccine side, you might be thinking about helping your community. You might be thinking about, wow, I'm doing something good for society. If you have stage 4 cancer, I think a very large part of your consideration set is simply staying alive. And a clinical trial in that case may be a very viable treatment option. So the direction of your decision-making varies as a participant and who you are. But I want to go back to what Dr. Gore was saying about the types of relationships that people have with doctors and with the clinical operators and sites. It's the comfort, it's the trust. Do I belong here? And I would encourage all of us the next time you go to a doctor's office to look around and see how many people look really like they are at comfort, that they are like, hey, I feel good, I'm being here, I'm well treated, I'm not nervous. I would venture to say very few people feel that way sitting in a doctor's office. So That's going to extend perhaps even more when you get into investigational therapies. The decentralized aspect opens up options. So it's not, again, it's not one size fits all, but it gives options to people. So if I want to do something at home, that might be great. Another person might really want to get out of their house and get into the clinic. That might be great for them. We might offer in-home services. That might be great for some. But in other cases, if I live in a neighborhood where all my neighbors are going to say, hey, who came to your house yesterday? I saw that they were carrying a bunch of stuff. What's wrong? What's wrong with you? That might not be great for them. So we really need options for everyone, and our protocols to allow for those options as much as possible.
Thank you so much. Randy, if there's an opportunity, I would like to see if Christian can say a little bit about how they approach the community for us.
Well, that would be great. And actually, Dr. Gore, so there's two questions. I'm going to say both, and maybe we can start with the one directed to you and your team. A special thank you to all of the speakers for a great presentation. We'll circle back to you, Michelle, for a question with you that says, in your case example, how do you measure impact? And if you can share, how did you secure commitment from the organization for these particular partnerships? And then Dr. Gore, and we'll go to you and we'll circle back to you, Michelle. You mentioned having bilingual staff has made a huge difference. And I think this will speak specifically to your colleagues on the line. How do you measure the impact, good question, of the diverse staff has on your study? So if you can start off, Dr. Gore, then we'll circle back to you, Michelle. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Sure. I mean, I think I would like Christian to address this, but I'll say for myself, our enrollment of bilingual, actually Spanish-speaking participants from the Latino community is highest among the consortium of the Recover that we are part of. And I attribute it to the fact that we now have folks that look like the community, speak the language. So I would say, Christian, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think at the beginning of the summer this year, we start going out in the communities, attending different health fairs, different events that involve the Hispanic population, especially in New Brunswick. And we also not only kind of present our faces in the community, but also with the different community-based organization working with them. So through them, we connected with other people, and among those, we met the health promoters from the hospital. And then they start telling us about the way they work. They literally go door by door, recruiting and telling people about different studies, different programs. And that's how we were able to build that trust through them. And now it's like a team that we work together with. We have different events, they refer people, and we also try to support the different initiatives that they deal with. I don't know if Viviana, she's also the other coordinator, wants to say something.
For us has been very important to be in contact with the health promoters. We have the fortune at the Robert Wood Johnson Hospital to count with them, because as you said, it's really important that the participants or the possible participants feel the people who is in contact with them comes from the same culture. Sometimes some of them even don't have access to the healthcare system. And through these health promoters, they are reaching some access to it and to some education. And because of that, they have more knowledge about the studies.
Thanks, Viviana and Christian.
Thank you both. Michelle, we'll circle to you now with the question about the partnerships you shared and, how you measure success in a sense and how you got got approvals to move forward and whatnot.
Yeah, so the commitment from the organization can vary, and it really depends on what we're doing. So in both cases, in both of those case studies, there was a relationship with medical affairs, because you can imagine that depending on the commercial status of the asset that is under study, medical affairs has a vested interest in supporting the doctors in that environment, in those geographies. So in that case, our medical affairs teams were very interested in cultivating the relationships in the communities for the doctors to make sure that there's some really good conversations taking place. So that was one part. And so I would say definitely try to stretch out beyond solely clinical operations. There might be opportunities in med affairs, there might be opportunities in commercial even, in order to say, hey, do you want to learn a little bit about how this drug or this vaccine or this device came to market? Let's tell you about that, because people were involved, right? As far as measurement, they were a little bit different, but in some cases they were very quote unquote marketing style measurement with respect to how many people did we interact with, how many site visits did we get, how many click-throughs did we get, how much material were we able to disseminate into the communities, how much readership did we get. We had site actual events, so we wanted to understand how many people were we able to visit, how many patients were we able to interact with, to say, hey, you know, we contacted. And I'm actually going to tie this, Randy, to the question from Jay with respect to diversity criteria and goals. Nobody knows exactly how strong of an enforcement the regulatory bodies will take. Today, there's no limit. Today, the FDA can say, hey, we really don't think you got appropriate data. So we're either going to, you know, ask for a PMC or a PMR, you know, phase 4 or post-marketing type of study. Or in certain cases, we've already seen in the industry attempts to translate studies from one population into another were simply not approved, because we saw, you know, we didn't think as a whole that that data was necessarily appropriate for the community you're trying to serve. So that can happen today already. Will we be held to a higher standard moving forward as the guidance becomes in force sometime in 24? Probably. Yes. Part of that is programs like I showed, to say, hey, we are really doing the work to get information into the hands of patients and participants, to say, this is the situation, this is what you have available. We did work to try to get in front of patients of diverse backgrounds, and this is how it's going.
Thank you. So there's another question from my good friend Larry, and Kelly, maybe you'll jump in on this one, although I'm sure all of our speakers will be able to share some info or insight. Aside from the challenges to attracting a more diverse population to participate in a clinical trial, can you give us some visibility into why it's often quite difficult for participants in general to stay engaged? To what extent have you seen technology play a role in making it easier to attract a more diverse population to trials?
Yeah, absolutely. So the average clinical trial participant has to travel over 2 hours each way to go to a clinical trial site. And the average clinical trial has a lot of visits. So when we expect that a patient has to travel 4 hours to go to a site every couple of weeks for a clinical trial, that's a ton of time that a patient has to take off from work. So not everybody has unlimited PTO. Not everybody wants to use the, couple of weeks that they have for PTO to participate in a study. Even though the procedures and therapies that are included in a protocol are provided at no cost, there are other costs to participating in a trial that can include things like parking and childcare, and gas and transportation and hotel stays, and I could go on and on. And we are seeing that more patients are being compensated for clinical trial participation, but even that process is clunky too, right? So it's additive. In terms of communication, the communication provided to patients typically isn't the best. All has to go through IRB approval for very good reason, but I think that really causes some trial teams to just say, I don't even want to communicate or provide this communication because I don't want the IRB to say no, or I don't even know where to start. And so typically they just, leave it up to the site to do, and the site's already burdened as well. So there's lots and lots and lots of reasons why participating is hard, but there are things that we can do to make it easier. Using the right technology solutions that are easy for patients, that are designed for patients by patients, certainly helps. Adding elements of decentralization, like we talked about, helps. And then improving communication. So a patient who knows what's expected of her is more likely to be retained in a study. The worst thing you can do is just say, well, she signed the informed consent, so she's going to know what to do. Yeah, that's a 30 to 50 page document that is really hard to understand. So we need to continue to educate, empower, and engage patients so that they know that clinical research is an option. We need to make it easier to participate, and then we have to make it easier to continue to participate in research.
I'm just going to add one thing, and I think it has to do with that informed consent, which is just horrible. I mean, it just doesn't work. We are required to do it. I've seen in some studies where they have the informed consent, but there is a lay language simplified document that's also IRB approved, that is used in addition, and that's really what they understand. And I think we need to have that in every study, because no one understands informed consent. We lose them. It's just written very difficult, lots of legal stuff that's stuck in there. It needs to improve. I mean, to the extent we can do that, that will really help in participation.
Thank you. So there's, I'm sorry, did I?
No, I'm just going to say one more thing. The
Please.
technology, I think, is great, but sometimes it's also difficult for patients to really understand technology. They're not always savvy for the technology piece. So we have to consider that. On the site level, they need a lot of teaching to guide them through technology.
And that's a really easy place for the industry and our partners to forget what normal actually is. And so, it's not iPhones, it's not high-end Samsung, it's not any of this. We're talking about much simpler technology that is wider spread amongst the majority of our populations and people, where we just have to take a step back and say, let's make sure we're all stepping out of our bubble and understanding what everybody is actually interacting with.
Thank you. So we have another question. Actually, this is a topic that we discussed at our webinar that we did on September 21st. So I just mentioned that because that is also recorded and available on our website. And maybe I'll follow when we send our evaluation out to all of you. I'll make sure that you all have a link to that one as well in case you missed it. But all the conversations here are great about diversity. However, what are we doing for mixed race, transgender, or unique population? The past data clearly shows that even gender diversity has been an issue. These are drugs that are being used actively. So I know that, this is, look, Michelle wants to jump on that. That's great, because I was going to say, I know this is top of mind for many. That's why we had discussed it at the last webinar. So please jump in.
Well, I'll use myself as an example here. I'm about, roughly speaking, according to 23andMe, and I'm sure apparently you can go download my data yourself now. But for 23andMe, tells me I'm approximately 20% sub-Saharan African. Nowadays, I can typically check multiple boxes. So I can say, yes, I'm white, yes, I'm black, yes, I'm whatever else I might be. What do we do with that information, and how do we collect it? How do we analyze it? For the particular drug, vaccine, what have you, device, we read a lot about pulse oximeters and different skin colors, for example. Where is that 20% of me that is from Nigeria and Ghana and so on? Where is that relevant to the drug? How do I know I should take that into account or not? Am I checking, if I'm trying to collect people, do I qualify as 2 of those people or just 1, and which one? So that mixed race is going to continue to be a challenge for the industry to figure out what to do and how to analyze. And what we're doing, for example, and I know a lot of the people who sit in my seats in different companies are doing very similar actions, thankfully, is to collect all the data possible so that, and I'm talking about not just race and ethnicity, I am talking about gender identity, I am talking about sexual orientation, I am talking about certainly the varieties of different types of sex and gender identities. We don't know what it will mean until we have enough of that data. And also outside of the US, Black African American doesn't really exist outside of the United States. Somebody in Kenya in Africa certainly doesn't consider themselves African American and may very well not consider themselves Black. Somebody in Haiti, for example, doesn't necessarily consider themselves that way either, and so on. So we need to look locally in order to understand what people feel themselves collected appropriately as. As we collect this information as granularly as possible, we're starting to understand what is really meaningful, because even race and ethnicity is a construct that may or may not be really attuned to what needs to be collected. It may very well be socioeconomic, but we can't remove it, because trust me when I tell you that somebody who is Black in the United States, a lot of their life is because of being Black in the United States, not because of African descent. And so we can't remove that, because that impacts health as well. And so that's the true nature of social determinants of health and economics, and also background and origin. They're all mixed. So when you say mixed, that's a strong word.
Let me just jump in from the site level. So, you know, we're doing a study among transgender children. And what we've done is engaged with the community-based transgender support groups. We've gone to them and presented our studies, and of course, they are getting enrolled from physicians' offices. But we've been successful in engaging in that particular study with the community. So I think, again, going to the community, working with those community groups and their disease-specific, community-specific groups that we should all be going to and, you know, educating and about clinical trials and clinical studies. The study I'm talking about is also an observational study, although there are many arms of that study and it's a little bit involved, but, you know, that's how we approach that.
So we only have a few minutes left, but I really do want to throw this question out, and maybe we can answer it somewhat quickly, because I know that, you know, I want to be mindful of the time, but we've been talking a lot about, you know, interventional and observational studies, and I should have gotten to this question earlier. Someone asked, you know, can we explain what the difference is between the two? And so I think that, you know, if our speakers can speak to that for a minute or two, that would be really helpful.
I can tackle that if you want. So,
Thank you.
I mean, the definition, NIH has a definition of clinical trial, which is basically when you are doing a prospective study where you are putting people into a intervention arm and a control arm. So that intervention can be a drug, a device, or it could be some sort of psychological counseling, but it's broadly interpreted. So that's a clinical trial, and it's an interventional study. Observational studies are cohort studies where you take a group of people with similar diseases or some similar characteristics, and then follow them over a period of time and compare them with another group, a control group. You may or may not have that, but many have that, a control group that does not have that disease entity. You don't do any intervention. You're basically observing the course of the disease during which, or the condition during which you could be doing testing, X-rays, EKGs, whatever they're those, but it's not something that you're doing to them to alter the course of the disease.
So probably a real world example of those, a very notorious one is the Tuskegee syphilis study. Was an observational, a very twisted observational study where you found a set of Black men and you watched syphilis proceed without intervention, as Dr. Gore was mentioning. A clinical trial, an interventional one, would be taking a set of folks who then you introduce either a vaccine or a medication and watch for the differential signal there.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our speakers today. We only have a minute left, so we will leave it there. We do have a best practices database where many of our companies have shared their works and examples of what they've done. Please take a look. Please share your work as well. This is how we're going to move the needle, is by working together. We welcome you participating in that. Be on the lookout for future events. We plan on continuing the work in this area into 2024, and we can't do it without you. So thank you again to Michelle, Kelly, and Dr. Gore. Thank you to our supporting sponsors who you'll see up on the screen who makes this work possible. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.